Antes que nada, un pequeño aviso que me ha hecho Paloma. Con la tarjeta que tienen del Congreso pueden visitar la colección durante todo el día, hasta la clausura hasta el cierre del museo, a las 8 de la tarde. Hoy vamos a iniciar una nueva jornada. El primer relator será Sven Dupré. Sven is director of the Research Institute of History and Art History and professor of History of Art, Science and Technology at Utrecht University and at the University of Amsterdam. He will speak about the politics of conservation and art history, science, technologies, and expertise in the interbellum. Welcome, Sven, and I let you speak.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and the invitation to speak here, also to Marco and the other organizers. Given the roots of restoration and conservation in craft and artisanship, it's not been uncommon to consider scientific conservation as an emancipation from hands-on craftsmanship. As science came to dominate the methodology of the treatment of objects, according to Mariam Claver, and she considers the period around 1930 indeed as a key turning point in the shift towards scientific conservation and away from empirical restorers techniques. In a recently published book, we complicate this linear progression narrative of conservation and connoisseurship, shifting from art and craft to science in the 20s and 30s. Following the lives and trajectories of artists, chemists, collectors, museum professionals, and the institutional contexts in which they operated, from museums to universities and laboratories, the book hopes to show how developments in science and technology changed practices of art history and conservation without adopting a theological and linear narrative. It scrutinizes the collaborations and conflicts between conservators, chemists, and art historians to reveal how they fought over authority and expertise in a period marked by political upheaval and 2 world wars. Now, we adopt in the book an approach which highlights the politics of conservation and art history, focusing on expertise in and epistemic or shifting epistemic hierarchies. Now, historians of science and technology, such as Eric Ashe and Ursula Klein, have convincingly argued that experts in the context of the early modern state were neither scholars nor artisans, but sort of hybrid figures combining practical knowledge with scholarly wisdom. And in the histories of conservation and art history, according to the premise in the book, we likewise need to be attentive to the hybridity of the knowledge experts claim to possess if we want to move beyond, in my view, misleading origin stories of scientific conservation and technical art history. And in today's talk, I will illustrate this approach by showing, in light of the work that also Marco Cardinale and Anna González-Mozzo have done, how X-rays changed the practice of art history, a history which indeed has often been told in terms of adoption and resistance of science and technology by art historians. In the 1930s, following the first international conference, as we know, the French art historians Fernand Mercier, the director of the Laboratoire Microradiographique of the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Dijon, and Henri Faucillon, director of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, distinguished between external and internal technique, as already mentioned by Anna González-Mozzo yesterday. An external technique is visible at the surface of a work of art by using naked eye or photography. Internal technique concerns the artistic process, which can only be analyzed by application of radiography. But together with ultraviolet illumination, X-rays were the imaging technology driving new ways of studying the artistic process in collaboration with art historians at museums. Other early adopters were the art historian Walter Gref at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, about which we will hear much more from Andreas Burmester later today, and, of course, already mentioned extensively by and discussed by Marco Cardinale yesterday, Alan Burrows at the Folk Museum. Now, in the past decade, scholars, and many of them here in the room, have shown how the art world engaged with this new type of visual expertise. But it's worth noting that the scientific examination of art, and in particular imaging technologies, is completely absent from general histories of art history. And it's quite striking that Mercier, Faucillon, and Greve were museum professionals, especially given that art historical expertise was itself a battleground between universities and museums in this same period. And so, in this talk, I will discuss how X-rays entered academic art history, so art history at the university. Wilhelm Röntgen used X-rays to look at paint as early as 1896, after he had noticed by accident the effects of lead white paint on the laboratory door in the X-ray image. But despite experimentation with X-ray technology applied to the diagnosis of paintings in German science laboratories in the first decades of the 20th century, and the patenting, as we've heard, of the X-ray examination of paintings by the physician Alexander Faber, it was indeed only in the 20s and 30s that the technology became more widely and systematically applied to art. Alan Burroughs' acquisition of the first and extensive archive of X-ray images of paintings, first at the Fogg Art Museum in Cambridge, and later also of paintings in other museums on campaigns across the United States and Europe, was the most important driving force behind this. The processes involved in the adoption of Röntgen's technology in the study of art are similar to those in the medical field, which have been more extensively studied. So what is important is the standardization of the apparatus, the formation of archives of X-ray images, and the rise of an expert culture centered around the instruments and archives and their use in medical practice. However, Burroughs' archive was primarily about connoisseurship. So then, why were X-ray images adopted in art history? One may ask, art history, which defined itself as a discipline in those same very years at the beginnings of the 20th century by exactly distancing itself from connoisseurship. Now, for all the enthusiasm of Burroughs for building up an archive of X-ray images, the evaluation of the method famously by Wilhelm von Bode, director of the museums in Berlin, was that it was simply bogus, as we've already heard. Now, this negative response to X-ray images and its consequent slow adoption for the study of art following Röntgen was likely inspired by what Bode saw as an overstretching of its decisive potential, and likewise closely connected to the initial presentation by early adopters of X-ray technology as a method of art authentication. And this is, for example, illustrated in the case of Maximilian Toch, a turn of the 20th century industrial chemist specialized in paint manufacture, who took up X-rays to investigate paintings after the end of the First World War. In 1923, the Rutgers University art historian Jan van Dijk enlisted Toch's support of the sensational claim that most paintings around the world attributed to Rembrandt were the work of his students or followers. In 1931, Toch himself gave a lecture at the American Museum of Natural History in which he argued that only one out of 27 paintings attributed to Rembrandt in the collection of the Metropolitan was genuine because his X-rays revealed brushstrokes entirely different from Rembrandt's. Now, while Toch opposed his so-called objective scientific evidence to the subjective judgments of the art connoisseurs, those same experts dismissed Toch's authentication arguments as a chemist's notion of how a painter works. Now, these were almost literally the words of the Dutch connoisseur Cornelis Hofstede de Groot in the pamphlet Real or Fake, Eye or Chemistry, discussed by Arjan de Krome yesterday, and which was published in response to the court case Müller versus de Haas in 1925. The court case concerned a painting, A Merry Man, which Hofstede de Groot had attributed to Frans Hals, and which was subsequently disputed on the basis of expert reports, among others by Franz Scheffer, professor of inorganic chemistry at Delft University. Now, Hofstede de Groot refused to address Scheffer, though, because one cannot fight over art with a chemist. In response to the question he posed in his title, Hofstede de Groot famously decided for the eye as the highest authority, just as the ear ears for music. Here, not the tuning fork, there, not the test tube, as we've already heard. Now, the practices of connoisseur centered around attributing and authenticating works of art. The principles upon which these practices were based were considered to be rational. It was, in this sense, a science. Just like natural philosophy and history, connoisseurship was based on comparative visual analysis. Connoisseurs, like natural philosophers, prioritized observation over textual exegesis. For its practitioners, connoisseurship was a disciplined way of seeing and knowing, one in which perception, reason, and judgment were applied in classification and interpretation of works of art. The attribution of a work to an artist was similar to a natural historian's classification of natural specimens. It was based on the recognition of the archetype intuited from cumulative experience of works of art, or nature, for that matter. The practice of the connoisseur crucially depended upon access to works of art, which in the era before photography took place via print. For early 20th century connoisseurs like Max Friedlander and Cornelis Hofstede de Groot, their knowledge depended upon innate talent, they claimed, a pictorially attuned eye and a good memory of form, color, and line. Yet, the eye of apprentice connoisseurs needed to be trained by attentively and repetitively looking at paintings. By travel, Hofstede de Groot heralded the train as the most important contributing factor to the development of art history, I remind you, visiting as many collections and museums as possible, and by critically comparing the works of art. Connoisseurship ultimately depended upon intuition, which cannot be expressed in words. In his book on art and connoisseurship, published in 1942, Friedlander positioned the connoisseur as the expert in the museum, different from the academic art historian. Now, Friedlander was not outspokenly against the application of scientific methods for the study of art. He argued that scientific methods such as X-ray photography, what he called X-ray photography, supply, in his words, quote, a diagnosis of the medical case without which a prudent restorer should not proceed to the operation. But as with photography, Friedlander also warned for the limits of the new image technology. He wrote, the X-ray photography is capable of teaching the experienced connoisseur a lot, but it confuses the inexperienced one and lures him into false deductions. And Friedlander might have had the case in mind of the Netherlandish panel of St. Luke painting The Virgin, which Philip Handy, curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, sent to Berlin in 1932 to decide if it could be attributed to Rogier van der Weyden. And Burroughs' X-radiograph of the Boston panel had shown a shift in the contours of the Virgin's hat, initially painted in a slightly different position, thereby proving that this of the four known panels was the original composition, but leaving the issue of attribution open for debate. And in the correspondence between Boston and Berlin, which ensued, Handy enthusiastically supported the use of X-rays while misinterpreting the image, as if it could univocally discriminate between the original paint and later restorers' retouches. X-ray technology required the acquisition of new observational skills to see and interpret X-ray images in relation to the originals and surface photographs. And that is the core of Alan Burroughs' project. For Burroughs, a course in the scientific study of pictures should not immediately deal with history, but should teach the student to look at the contents and execution of pictures. Burroughs intends to provide students with a language of describing and interpreting X-ray images, as Marco Cardinal already mentioned yesterday. Now, given the physical properties of X-ray imaging technology, he notes that it is particularly apt to study the use of white in a painting, and he teaches students of art history to interpret these X-ray images by comparing them with drawings with which they would have been intimately familiar from examination of originals with the naked eye. We see in the shadow graph, he wrote, the tense pigment which creates the three-dimensional design, the modeling, and the shapes of luminous objects, much as they are created by the use of a black crayon on white paper in a drawing. The not so astonishing fact is that most shadow graphs have the appearance of drawings in paint, in Burroughs' words. X-ray images can help with the attribution of paintings, sure, But this will not only be possible by training the eye's judgment upon larger collections of X-ray images. Burroughs emphasizes the portability of X-ray images, allowing the connoisseur to compare the brushwork of pictures which are widely scattered. The logic of Burroughs' archive of X-ray images is built upon connoisseurship, but similar to the formation of visual expertise by comparing as many X-ray images as possible in medical institutes in those same years. At least this is how Burroughs presented the X-ray imagery in his 1938 book, Art Criticism from the Laboratory. And complementary to the picture of Burroughs' career, which Marco Cardinali portrayed yesterday, even Hapler Smith has observed that Burroughs' presentation of the technology had turned remarkably different from his rhetoric when initially adopting X-rays in the mid-1920s. In Burroughs' initial experiments on actual paintings in the collection of the Fog, he discovered, for example, a portrait of Franz Purvis the Younger beneath a layer of overpainting, which was consequently removed. In the hands of Burroughs, this discovery became a canonical example, not just for the adoption of X-ray technology, but in support of science, opposing and replacing earlier methods of art connoisseurs. However, the painting was not selected at random. It had been known beforehand that it was a 19th century overpainting, and the X-rays had thus only corroborated something which was already known by other methods, rather than expose something radically and unexpectedly new. In the following years, Burroughs would switch gears, launching his campaign of collecting hundreds of X-rays in museums in the United States and Europe. And in this process, X-ray technology became a tool of documentation rather than art authentication. Instead of celebrating science opposing methods of connoisseurship, Burroughs presented X-ray technology as an instrumental aid in support of the expert's appreciation. In this way, Burroughs canonized X-ray imagery, but given the distance of connoisseurship associated with the museum world to which Burroughs belonged, to art history as taught and researched at the university, it was left to others, Christian Wolters and especially Martin de Wild, to embed it in practices of academic art history. Burroughs' efforts were inspirational for Kurt Welte, the German Maltechniker who in the 30s established a laboratory for the X-ray investigation of paintings in Berlin. In 1932, Welte was called to court to deliver his expert testimony on the authenticity of the Van Goghs in the Wacker case. Now, Welte's performance in front of the judges pointing to X-ray images, among other photographs, physically present in the courtroom and interpreting them with remarkable attention to the physiognomy of the paint and brushstrokes, showcases a new type of visual expertise and his recognition as a connoisseur of X-ray images in the art world. So this new type of visual expertise, continuing traditional connoisseurship by other means, was in line with Burroughs' eventual portrayal of X-ray technology as an instrumental aid in need of expert judgment. Welte's success in the Wacker case shows that in this capacity, X-ray technology had indeed become accepted. In 1938, the same year Alan Burroughs' book, Art Criticism from the Laboratory, appeared, Christian Wolters published his dissertation Die Bedeutung der Gemäldedurchleuchtung mit Röntgenstrahlen für die Kunstgeschichte, emphasizing the art historical significance of X-ray images produced in Welter's laboratory. In line with Welter's characterization of X-ray imagery as requiring a new type of visual expertise continuing traditional connoisseurship, in an interview with Michael von der Goltz in 1998, Wolters called X-ray images an, quote, even more intense sensory experience. After the Second World War, the director of the Derner Institute, Wolters was one of the first to combine the pursuit of a doctoral degree in art history with an apprenticeship as a restorer. Wolters' doctor father, Wilhelm Pinder, professor of art history in Berlin, strongly emphasized formal analysis, like many other art historians in the pre-war period, who were trained in Alois Riegel's Vienna school and who are often said to have used Riegel's notion of Kunstwollen to distance art history from the study of materials and techniques. However, precisely the adoption of X-ray technology in art history in the 30s shows that this historiography is in need of revision. Wolters identified two fields of research where X-ray technology contributes to art history. First, X-ray imagery can make visible the painting process. Wolters warned that the X-ray image is not a sort of snapshot in this process. It does not show an unfinished painting. Instead, it's one image of all layers of the painting, and it's impossible to tell by eye, looking at an X-ray image of the painting, which are the different steps in the process. The interpretation of the layered X-ray image requires in-depth knowledge of materials and techniques acquired by other means and resources. Like Burroughs, Wolters drew the analogy between an X-ray image and a drawing, contrasting the contours and shadows in the drawing to the painting, which light made visible in the X-ray image. And this directly connects to the second field where X-ray technology can make a contribution to art history. As Burroughs also pointed out, X-ray technology was particularly apt to study white in a painting, and Wolters took up this physical property of X-ray technology to show that X-ray images allowed the art historian to understand the different ways of using light in painting. In this way, more than through the study of composition of lines and surfaces, the X-ray image makes visible the plastisch-räumlichen Bildgefüge, as Wolters argued. And these Lichtgefüge, a concept with a legacy, as we will see, are also visible on the surface of the painting. But familiarity with X-ray imagery allowed the art historian to discern them more sharply and clearly than when looking at the painting's surface. Now, the opportunities and challenges which Wolters identified for art history supported by X-ray technology are reflected in the teaching of art history at Utrecht University in the 20s and 30s, in particular by Martin de Wilde. Trained as a chemical engineer, as we've already heard from Arjan de Komen yesterday, de Wilde was born in one of the most prominent families of Dutch restorers who had set up a conservation studio in The Hague and were involved in restoration commissions at the Mauritshuis. His uncle Karel and his father Derks de Wilde had shown a keen interest in the application of chemistry of painting materials in conservation and restoration, involving for the first time a chemist, Gosen van der Sleen, in their restoration of 3 group portraits of regents and regentesses and 5 civic guard paintings by Frans Hals between 1911 and 1927. They kept extensive documentation of the scientific examination and the restoration. De Wilde, as we've already heard, also devoted one chapter of his doctoral dissertation, which he defended in 1928 at the Technical University of Delft, to X-ray of paintings. And we see him here in the photograph to the left, operating an X-ray apparatus, which is in fact the Philips Metallics Junior, developed in 1928 for the medical world, and the first portable machine with which de Wilde traveled to paintings in collections, as such an important step in the standardization of the technology. In 1938, the same year in which Burroughs and Wolters published their work on X-ray technology for art, de Wilde was appointed as privaatdocent at the Institute for Art History at Utrecht University to teach the scientific examination of art. In his inaugural lecture, de Wilde made it clear what he considered the most important skills to teach students of art history. From X-ray images of paintings, art historians can learn more about the material construction of a painting than with the naked eye, he argued, but only if they've been taught how to interpret these shadow graphs. New ways of scientifically examining art in the laboratory required students of art history to learn new observational skills. De Wilde's appointment at Utrecht supported a conception of art history uniting formal analysis with the study of materials and techniques and a scientific examination of art. In 1917, the inaugural professor of art history at Utrecht University, Willem Vogelsang, educated in the Vienna School, appointed G.T.A. Swillens as his assistant. And in the following decades, until his retirement in 1955, Swillens brought together a technical collection. As Vogelsang's assistant, his most important job consisted of drawing the plates supporting Vogelsang's classes in art history, which focused on composition, form, and perspective. Swillens' technical collection was a teaching collection, primarily used for demonstration purposes in the lecture hall. It contained, in fact, very few historical authentic objects. One exception is a painter's box of circa 1830 containing paints in bags made of pig's bladder, but most materials and instruments were purpose-made for the collection, including this selection of pigments made by de Wild himself and displayed here in the cupboard. Now, equally important for Swillens were the collection of books, articles, photographs, and newspaper clippings. It included a collection of X-ray images ranging from photographs to illustrations cut from books to journal and magazine articles, which were used for teaching art histories to students in Utrecht. Now, it's important to note that de Wild's training of the apprentice art historian's eye to see and interpret X-ray images was embedded in a conception of art history in the style of the Vienna School and the development of a curriculum in which teaching of painting techniques more generally, supported by Swillen's technical collection, was crucial. Much like Walter's advice that the expertise to interpret X-ray images should build upon a substratum of knowledge of painting techniques. To conclude, the history of X-ray technology in the history of art in the 1920s and 30s shows that it was not simply a matter of art versus science, that is, of the eager adoption by scientists embarking on the art historical terrain from their recently established museum laboratories versus the outright rejection of the technology in circles of connoisseurs and art historians. Instead, the sort of knowledge which early adopters of X-ray technology like Wild and Burroughs for the study of art imagined to be required of researchers and students of art history was based on older models of connoisseurship. Only this visual expertise should be broadened to include the interpretation of X-ray images. And these new ways of seeing and knowing were grounded in a firm knowledge of materials and techniques and of the painting process acquired by the handling of objects, the visual examination of paintings with the naked eye, and the enactment of processes of making. Moreover, it was not the case, as has often been assumed, that academic art history remained immune to X-ray technology, or that art historians at university always rejected it. As we've seen, X-ray imagery was accepted when it supported a particular style of doing art history, which was structured around formal analysis and which, radiating from Vienna, made school across Germany and the Netherlands. And hybrid figures with one foot in the restoration workshop and another in the academic world, like de Wild and Wolters, played a crucial role here. Wolters' dissertation seems to have been more consequential also for academic art history than so far assumed. In 1954, Wolfgang Schöne, professor of art history at the University of Hamburg, published Über das Licht in der Malerei. And while the book does not include one single X-ray image, Wolters' perception of X-ray imagery as drawing with light has been inspirational for Schöne, who made Lichtgefüge into the book's central concept. The book remained without much immediate influence in the following paradigm-shifting years. And this is not, I would argue, because academic art history universally rejected X-rays, rather precisely because X-ray imagery became embedded in a specific practice of art history. It lost its significance when in the 60s, formal analysis was replaced by doing new ways of art history. Thank you very much.